Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you for all being here. That's a pretty good crowd, and a good-looking crowd, I must say. Just to begin, there's an announcement I wanted to make, but I didn't know quite where to put it in my opening remarks here. So I think I'll just deliver it now as soon as we get started. Deborah Evans, the head of paper conservation for the Fine Arts Museums, will be retiring in early December after 37 years. And it's closer to 40 if you include her internship here before she started. Debbie loves our books, and under her direction, the Conservation Lab has developed innovative techniques for their display. As a parting gift to us, she is curating the next exhibition in the Reva and David Logan Gallery of Illustrated Books, and it's called Curious and Wonderful. It's showcasing some of her favorite little scene books in our collection, and it opens November 16th. Debbie is someone I've really drawn on her knowledge of our collection in my work here, and we are going to be so sorry to see her go, but her exhibition is going to be really special. Debbie's here today. Would you stand up so we can give you a proper round of applause? I don't know how we're going to get along without her. We will persevere. Just a few opening notes. We're breaking today's program into two parts. There'll be a 15 intermission between the two parts. The first is going to be the longer of the two. It's a keynote presentation, followed by two 20-minute talks before our 15-minute intermission. We may be able to allow, something like 5 minutes between each presentation, even though all of our presenters today are technical wizards, completely in control, I must say. We will attempt to appear confused in these interim periods occasionally, so that you might have time, for example, for a really quick bathroom break without missing too much. And we want you to be comfortable. Our actual tech crew is great. Rich Rice has been helping us out a great deal. And we're not doing Q&A. For some reason, it never really has worked for these programs. But if we're on time after we finish today, we'll be able to head down the hall to the Achenbach to have a look at books some of the presenters have brought, and you can all talk to them there. Okay, here we go. The Reva and David Logan collection of illustrated books is one of the great historic collections in the United States. It includes a large majority of the most important 20th century works, and is particularly strong in the great French books from the first half of the century, and in Picasso. It was a significant gift to the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, arriving here in 1998. And we are doing our best to do justice to the collection with the initiative that I am privileged to lead here. I didn't introduce myself. I think I know most of you. I'm Steve Woodall, and I am the collection specialist for artist books at the Achenbach Foundation for Graphic Arts. So our initiative is to create greater public and scholarly engagement with the Reva and Logan collection of illustrated books. The Logan family, among their many other philanthropic projects, has made a strong commitment to both the history and the future of the book as a fine art medium. All of Reva and David's three sons, Jonathan, Daniel, and Richard, have been supportive of our work, but Jonathan has been by far the most deeply involved in what we do here. His foundation, the Jonathan Logan Family Foundation, has generously supported our initiative and morally supported it as well, which includes, initiative includes today's program and much more. John is here today with members of his foundation, and John, maybe nobody can see you, but would you mind standing up so we can acknowledge? There he is. So besides this annual symposium, 3 exhibitions a year in the Logan Gallery, and a variety of smaller programs throughout the year. We're producing a series of 3 interactive websites devoted to the collection. This just went up online about 2 weeks ago, and I'm really happy with it. We worked on this for about a year. This is the second of the 3 that we had planned. And this one celebrates 20 years of the Logan collection in San Francisco, and it's a broad overview of the collection. That's Ambroise Vollard in his studio in Paris in the 1930s, the great art dealer and publisher of artist books. Those are the bad boys of surrealism, Louis Aragon and Andre Breton. And this is an amazing, really kind of very remarkable animation of Lissitzky's treatment of Mayakovsky's poems. All designers know this book called For the Voice. Radek Skrivanik is here today, and I just want to give him a shout out because he's just an amazing, magical animator. So you really have to see this. And to do that, you go there. FAMSF stands for Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. So please find it. It's good. I'm going to take that away. We're not there yet. No, now we're good. Those of us who work with or create artist books often have to answer the question, what is an artist book? Somehow painters and sculptors don't have to answer a question like that. You can just say it's a book made by an artist, but in fact the artist book is a thing fundamentally to virtually everyone's experience, whether they realize it or not, because the first books we knew before we could read were picture books with stories that were read aloud to us. We absorbed the stories and the rhythms of their narratives, and at the same time, were drawn into a visual environment created by a visual artist. And perhaps even felt in those moments that we lived inside the book. Our first books gave us an alternate reality to inhabit. In a very real sense, artist books are children's books for an adult sensibility. You can fall into a great artist book, and it is an art viewing experience like no other, immersive and engaging, with meaning that unfolds progressively, visually and cognitively as you open a sequence of visual environments with the turn of each page. An artist book engages your eyes, your brain, and even your body. So these are, a few examples of what I'm talking about. This is Max Ernst's magnificent collaboration with Ilias de Maximiliana from 1964. These are all part of our collection. This is a recent addition to our collection. This is Ward Shoemaker's dreamlike narrative, Markandeya, from 2006. This is Clifton Medder's epic retelling of Martin Luther King's Selma to Montgomery March, Long, Slow March, published in 1995. And the first book that the Logans collected, an incredible, beautiful book that was 10 years in the making with 79 original Joan Miro woodcuts in collaboration with the poet Paul Éluard, à toute épreuve. This is Chant des Morts, Picasso and the poet Pierre Reverdy, published in 1948, Reverdy's somber poems about the German occupation of France, which he lived through. This is what we're calling a permeable borderland between art and literature, and I'm being played off, so I'm almost finished. Between art and literature, and that is what we're looking at in this year's symposium. We are fortunate to be able to shed light on this mysterious dynamic today from several different perspectives. Our keynote speaker, Susan Tallman, is one of our most highly esteemed exponents of printed and editioned artworks. The journal she has edited for nearly 10 years, Art in Print, has been one of the most respected journals in the field and has had an impact in bringing artist books into the discourse on contemporary art and art history. Please welcome from Chicago, Susan Tallman.
I have to admit that when Steve asked me to do this, I was slightly trepidatious because basically I am completely unqualified to be standing here. I'm not a specialist in artists' books, and I know that there are way more people in this room who know way more about artists' books than I do. But we had just finished an issue of the journal on books, and I had books on the brain, and I thought, well, I can sit down and I can come up with something insightful and useful and interesting to say about the relationship between text and image. And so I sat down to lay out my thoughts, and nothing. Or nothing that could plausibly be called useful or interesting or insightful or not blindingly obvious. So there was a problem, but part of my issue at that moment was that at the same time I was trying to think about artists' books, I was dealing with my late mother-in-law's house, including her library of 3,000 books. So all the while I wanted to be having deep thoughts, I was going through book after book after book, and having done the initial easy recycling cull, how many marked up acid-laden paperbacks of 11th grade Great Gatsby's does one family actually need to hold on to? There are still a couple thousand volumes left that required serious evaluation. Keep, sell, donate, landfill not an option. We are the bibliophilic equivalent of a do not kill shelter. So, day after day, one after one, open books, examine them for edition information, dedications, secreted letters, photographs. And it made me think about what it is that makes us stop and look at something. Some things got put aside to read, some things got put aside to keep. These were often not the same things. In the mix were a number of artists' books. And these were obviously really annoying because they required you to stop and figure them out. And usually their aims were not clear from the title or the title page or the colophon, and probably 50% of the time not even from the contents. So you actually had to work at this, and this, of course, is exactly what made them delightful at the same time. So I began to think about the attributes that make you stop, weigh the opportunity cost to your time and attention, and decide that you're going to invest. The things that make you conscious of your own expectations, of the mental dance that comes with the turning of a page, of the anticipation of what's to come, the memory of the page now hidden. In other words, books that flirt, books that you want to hold as well as read, books that you put someplace so that you'll come across them really regularly. I've often thought that coffee table books should actually be the highest praise we can give something, because it means you want it there in front of you all the time. People will often say, oh, I love books, but usually it's kind of just a statement about liking the idea of ideas. What I really want to talk about today is what it means to love a book, or more specifically, how certain books are constructed to elicit that combination of intense attention and reflexive self-awareness that is at the heart of the entanglement that we think of as romantic. So what follows is not a coherent argument about what is or is not a good artist's book, or what role they should play in culture, or some kind of greatest hits overview of the entire history of artists' books. It's actually just kind of a set of personal observations about some books that I happen to know well. Since all these books date from the late 20th and beginning of the 21st century, the forms that they adopt and the references they make, implicitly or explicitly, have been with us a really long time. And because I am by training an historian, I always think the best place to start talking about contemporary art is the 15th century. There's a lot going on in, this is the famous Van Eyck altarpiece in Ghent. There's a lot going on in these panels, including a lot of reading. There's John the Baptist, he's the guy in green, large book in his lap with this beautiful bookmark. Below him, there's a bevy of dead popes who are walking and reading at the same time, always dangerous. Opposite them, there are these Old Testament guys kneeling with these really heavy books. Above them, we've got angels reading music while cranking an organ. On the back side of the panels that I'm showing you, there's more reading going on. There's people holding books. There's people pointing to books. There's somebody with their finger in a book. And the very fact that the altarpiece itself folds open and closed like a book just kind of adds to this busy emphasis on the action of reading. The altarpiece predates movable type in Europe by a couple of decades, so the books that the Van Eycks would have been thinking about and looking at when they were making the altarpiece would have been handwritten, probably on vellum, and more precious and magical than anything we can easily imagine. The profusion of books that they paint in the altarpiece is like the profusion of gold and jewels. It takes you out of the real world and into a kind of realm of glory. But the book that I'm most interested here is Mary's. You can see from the green cloth that dangles down from the covers and those nice little red tassels that this is a girdle book. And girdle books were these books that were bound with their own wrapper so that you could tie them up and hang them on your belt and carry them around with you wherever you went. Such a book is a spiritual statement. Presumably she's reading the Word of God. It's a pragmatic solution to a sartorial problem because they hadn't invented pockets yet. It's a fashionable accessory because it's drop-dead gorgeous. It shows Mary to be high-minded, down-to-earth, and splendid all at the same time. Girdle books were actually fairly common, even though not very many of them survive. We know that because they're illustrated in a lot of medieval manuscripts and paintings. Most of them really were not as gorgeous as hers. This one is from around the same time as the altarpiece and contains a text called The Consolations of Philosophy by Boethius. Boethius was a 7th century Roman Christian writer, wrote the thing while sitting in prison awaiting his execution. And it was this very popular text that kind of argued for the kinds of things that we still have lots of little plaques that people put up in their house to tell you to think about the larger picture, realize there's good in the world even when there's injustice. Join faith to reason was one of his key tenets. If you were wearing that book, you would become intimate with both its ideas and its material particulars, its weight, solidity, feel. Our nearest equivalent as an information-bearing accessory is our phone, but the girdle book was a mono-purpose item. It contained a small set of words that you would read over and over and over again. The words didn't change, they didn't get updates. But somehow having them at hand and hip was really desirable. And that kind of commitment to a single book is really intriguing and completely unfamiliar in our day and age. It's easy to blame printing for cheapening our relationship to the book because it did make books plentiful and affordable. This is an illustration from another earlier manuscript of Boethius, and it gives you an idea of what libraries looked like 2 centuries before the invention of movable type. It's a lovely room and a really wonderfully weird picture hanging on the wall, but it is not exactly teeming with books. And yet, less than 100 years after the Van Eyck altarpiece, Christopher Columbus's son Ferdinand was able to amass a library, personal library, of some 20,000 books and more than 3,000 prints. So much information in so many different physical objects that he had to invent whole new taxonomies and systems of description. This is his 2,000 handwritten account of the books in the library. He also had to invent bookshelves so that there was something to store it all on. So prints didn't just make books cheap, they spawned new conceptual spaces at the same time. Even the most opulently illuminated medieval manuscripts segregated word and image, pictures above, below, or around a rectangular block of text. In part, this reflected an allocation of labor. You had scribes who were in charge of one part of the page, and you had illuminators who were in charge of a different part of the page. With early printed block books, however, text and image could be carved together on a single wood block, and labor was divided differently. Now you had designers, block cutters, printers, and publishers, and the designers could play with both text and image and layout, giving rise to inventions like this wacky 15th century apocalypse. The advent of movable type then pushed us back into a system of segregating text and image again, but artists continued to think creatively about the book format. Albrecht Dürer's 1489 apocalypse, the apocalypse was very popular. Heading into 1500, everybody thought it all might end. This is the first book that we know of that is designed, illustrated, and published by an artist. And normally we look at it like this. Normally we think of it just as an array of pictures. And the reason that we think of it like that is because in laying out the book, he did one odd thing. He moved the text from below or beside the image to the back of the image so that you had your choice. You could look at the picture, you could read the text. You couldn't do them both at the same time. This had a couple of effects. One is that you were always playing a game of conceal and reveal. You never had both things there simultaneously. As the handler of the book, you were always making a choice. It also meant that he could take these astonishing images that he'd created and not simply have them bound in a book, but distribute them as unbound prints. And this was kind of typical of the book-print crossover for centuries. From the beginning, print lent itself to the idea of seriality for obvious reasons. You had, and continued to have, popular narrative series where the storyline was carried through the image or through image and text, but you had a beginning and an end and a kind of orderly chain of events. Other series were organized by typology or by pattern, where you had multiple iterations of something and variations that were used to elucidate a set of underlying principles like geometric solids or things that live in water. The difference between the book and the print series was pretty fuzzy because for centuries people didn't buy bound books. They bought pages and then they took them to their local bookbinder and had them bound to suit their personal taste or to match their library or to have them bound with another text that they thought related to it. They would hire somebody to color in the pictures. They would hire somebody to add illustrations. It wasn't the kind of end product that we think of it as being. Some books came with instructions for cutting pieces out and regluing them to make scientific instruments or pop-ups. There's the British science historian Boris Jardine noted that one of the more surprising things a wealthy Elizabethan owner of a beautifully illustrated folio volume could do was to take a sharp knife and cut it to pieces. When Audubon's Double Elephant Birds of America was published in the 19th century, some people bound it in gold-stamped Morocco, and other people broke the plates out and framed them and hung them on the walls. And Lady Hertford took hers, cut the birds out, and had them appliqued to her Chinese wallpaper. Recently restored, by the way. Even mass market publishers played around with interactive picture book hybrids like this Leporello panorama illustrating the 104th Psalm. You could think about it as a foldable painting, but the presence of the text causes a split focus. You're always moving between reading and looking, and as you can tell from the failure to make a slide in which you could both see the shape of the thing and have any idea what the images are, it's unwieldy. It's something that's very hard to contain in any particular way. You could think of it as a series of prints, except the text doesn't actually line up with the folds quite right, so you can't just use it as a regular book. And in the end, the reader is left in control of what to reveal and what to conceal at any given time. So the point of this historical digression is this. Since the 15th century at least, the book has been a place of intimate physical action, not of hands-off reverence. It's not just about reading or even looking. It's about touching and turning and wearing. There is a reason that Pat the Bunny remains a bestseller after 80 years, and it's not the text. And you can see this even in institutional settings. Until the 20th century, most great print collections were allied to libraries rather than art museums because they work in similar ways. They keep tons of stuff in storage that you can go in and ask to see. People sit at tables with a bunch of things in front of them. They handle them, group them, move their minds and their hands back and forth between them. It's not the way we look at painting. Paintings since the Renaissance have aspired to pull everything together into one space, to give us a kind of coherent vision. We usually view them one at a time, most often standing rather than sitting, and according to timing studies of museum visitors, for an average of 27 seconds. In 1943, Mark Rothko and Adolf Gottlieb wrote a statement to the New York Times about what they were trying to do in art. And while they certainly don't speak for all painters, they do articulate a widely held view of how painting is thought to operate. We favor the simple expression of the complex thought, they wrote. We are for the large shape because it has the power of the unequivocal. It is our function to make the viewer see the world our way, not his way. And various artists have tried to hammer away at this painterly unequivocal for the last 40, 50 years. But 75 years on, we are still in a place where painting is understood as a window. You stand on one side and look out. Books, on the other hand, are a door. You literally open them. You enter, you move about. The problem for us is that books have become such a pandemic and largely uniform presence in our world that it is easy to forget what a miraculous thing that door is. And this, I think, is where artists' books come in. In 1962, Ed Ruscha could have just hung 26 photographs of gasoline stations on a gallery wall and been done with it. And people would have said that they were plangent photographic statements of the empty American dream, or that they were celebrations of American vernacular architecture, or that it constituted a beat-era voyage of discovery into the nation's dry heart. But he didn't do that. Instead, he took the trouble to lay them out and paste them up when this actually required laying things out in an actual paste. He had typeset, and he paid to have it all offset printed and bound like a normal book. It's not a normal book. Normal books have a picture on the cover and text inside. 26 Gasoline Station has text on the cover and a picture and pictures inside. Normal books have a title that derives from the content of the work. Ruscha famously began with the title typography. He liked the word gasoline and the specific quality of 26 and the way it all looked in block letters. At first, the contents seem to conform to a typology. They are all gasoline stations, but unanswered questions start bubbling up immediately. Why 26? Why these 26? The captions give us the locations, all of which lay along Route 66 between Los Angeles and Oklahoma City. So it can be tempting to read it as a kind of close-lipped narrative, and it has been described more than once as a one-way street. But if you actually chart the locations in the order they appear in the book, you discover that the route is much less like a one-way street than it is like somebody doing embroidery while on LSD. Compositions that unfold in time, music, novels, film, jokes, tend to function in roughly the same way. You set up a structure of expectation. You throw a wrench into the works to disrupt those expectations. You then reweave the parts to form a satisfying, though not entirely predictable, resolution or punchline. 26 Gasoline Stations promises the arc of a story, but it doesn't provide it. The setup, the wrench, and the punchline are all exactly the same. The punchline is the lack of a punchline, and it works as a punchline because the very fact that 26 Gasoline Stations exists in Codex form as a book guarantees a certain set of expectation on the part of readers before they even crack the spine. The Library of Congress found the book so confounding when it was published, it declined to acquire it, citing its unorthodox form and lack of information. Ruscha was reportedly delighted. Another punchline. Ruscha was part of a generation that was starting to push back against certain aspects of modernism, particularly its defensive division between serious art and popular culture, and its equally defensive view of the artist as a locus of some special moral or metaphysical authority. In this context, the book, with its long cultural history, offered a host of possibilities beyond just page space for pictures. It constituted a metonym of authority that would be fun to undermine. It shared power with the viewer. Its sequential unfolding could be scripted to align with or defy the latent expectations of readers. As an object, it could be broadly owned and easily manipulated by the consumer. And as a reference, it could be both about another work of art and form a new work of art. Gerhard Richter's 128 Details from a Picture is, like 26 Gasoline Stations, a clearly labeled catalog of parts. And like 26 gasoline stations, it throws the utility of the catalog form under the bus. In the summer of 1978, Richter took 128 photographs of the surface of this painting. The photographs were taken from various sides, angles, distances, and under different light conditions. The painting was in color, but the photographic film was black and white. The book reproduces these photographs 2 per page. Altogether, they form a thorough document of the target painting without actually showing what it looks like. Like dental charts, they have a clear forensic connection to the subject, but they miss entirely the qualities that we instinctively use for recognition. Like most Richter works, 128 Details raises fundamental philosophical questions about what it means to represent something, among other things, by exposing the startling gap between telling the truth and making yourself understood. And it does so almost without recourse to words. Most artist books rely heavily on images rather than texts. Barbara Bloom's books are an exception. They actually require reading to make sense of. But they also almost always operate as extensions of other artworks. So this book, Ghostwriter, is double-sided. It reads in English in one direction and in German in the other direction. Those covers, by the way, that's supposed to be a solid color. I've never seen one that doesn't look like this. A few years on, and they all faded. Both halves, the English half and the German half, offer a compendium of scholarly and fictional texts that touch on the subjects of doubling, stand-ins, and substitutions. There are excerpts from Schopenhauer and from the letters of Flaubert, Joseph Alsop's Faker's Art, Poe's Murders on the Rue Morgue, Schumann Lieder on the German side, and the 1930s standard These Foolish Things Remind Me of You on the English side. What is missing is any actual discussion of Bloom's art. Her book, The Reign of Narcissism, takes the form of a pseudo-blue guide to her installation project of the same name. The installation is a neoclassical octagonal space decorated with sculpture, reliefs, little French side chairs, and vitrines of various collectibles. It takes a while being in there to realize that everything, from the chair upholstery to the cameos, to the busts to the floorboards, are portraits of the artist, one way or another. The book includes a map of the installation and texts borrowed from authors ranging from Hegel to Virginia Woolf on various types of knickknacks included in the show: chairs, busts, books, chocolates, teacups, tombstones. Tucked into the pages are a Narcissus bookmark and a sheet of stamps celebrating the artist's birth. The book functions as a souvenir, a catalog, a meditation on the supposed status of the artwork as a portrait of the artist, and a prop that actually extends the installation that it documents. Like Barbara Bloom, Christian Boltanski works with historical found material or imitation found material for most of his work. Sans Souci is a replica photo album, complete with spider-webbed interleaving. The opening page shows a group photo taken outside Frederick the Great's palace in Potsdam, which is named Sans Souci, which is French for carefree. Boltanski has explained the book's origin as follows. It's a photo album which I bought at a flea market in Berlin. Some of these nice-looking people became Nazis. We see a Christmas tree, music, babies. They were just like us. If the monster had been different from us, it would have been easier to deal with. But it was us. It's a book with no text, but if you read it, it leaves you with a question. Perhaps this is a question about whether one is guilty or not guilty, about being a victim or a criminal or both. History and personal agency are also the implicit subjects of Bethany Collins's hymnal. This is a collection of 100 versions of the song America, from God Save the Queen to My Country 'Tis of Thee, penned in 1831 by the New England Baptist minister Samuel F. Smith, to an 1839 abolitionist response, My Country 'Tis of Thee, Stronghold of Slavery, of Thee I Sing, to later versions written in support of temperance, of women's suffrage, of the Confederacy. On each page, the lyrics are clearly visible, but the music notation has been laser burnt away so that the pages start to merge and come apart. You can see one through the next. And you are left with a beautiful, messy, contradictory, argumentative whole that may be on the edge of coming completely apart with the title America. The Dutch artist Robin Vaart is another scavenger of the previously published, repurposing bits of found books into new lyrical statements. Part 1 is a book that is made up entirely of reproduced pages announcing Part 1, a volume of endless promise, an eternal beginning. His latest book is a collection of cryptic dedications that have been published in other books. For SCT in Monica Ali's Alentejo Blue, to NMS in Michael Palmer's Flashback, to JRM from Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, to BJC in Patricia Highsmith's A Suspension of Mercy, and on and on and on. Very, very faintly, I don't know if you can see it, probably not. Very faintly, you can see the bleed through of the title page on the other side. And there's also a crib sheet on the flyleaf at the back so that you can source all of these things in terms of where they were published, but you still have no idea who it is that they're dedicated to, with the exception of the last one, which says, to you. And it may feel like Vaart's own clever insertion, but it's actually from Jean Webster's 1912 epistolary novel, Daddy Longlegs. Vaart also uses whole books in installation projects to spell out messages. The titles of the books are not really the crucial thing here, but if you look at the publisher's logos at the bottom of the spine, they're all individual letters that spell out in various languages. This is the English language one, I love you. I'm not sure whether this counts as an artist's book or not. But surely the gold standard for obsessive retreatment of a found book has to be Tom Phillips' A Humament. In '66, Phillips set himself the task of finding a flea market secondhand book. He wasn't going to spend more than 3 pence, and altering every page through selective overpainting to create an entirely new story and object. The chance recipient of this treatment was a long-ignored 1892 novel called A Human Document by an even longer-ignored author named W.H. Mallock. Opening the book more or less at random over the course of several years, Phillips treated every page, inventing or discovering new characters and plot lines embedded in the extant text. He then published those pages as his own book. He then immediately set about reworking the whole thing from scratch. He has continued to do so through 6 separate editions over the course of some 50 years. I do realize that the selection of books that I'm showing here today is heavily weighted towards something borrowed rather than something new. But I find something profoundly, even cosmically satisfying about the productive reuse of an unloved or overlooked artifact. This may be a manifestation of the fact that we are still looking for forever homes for about 2,000 books, but it is also an acknowledgement of how culture works through adoption and adaptation, selecting from what the world offers and reshuffling the bits around to say something that hasn't been said before, using components that trail their own complicated history. Most of Christian Marclay's work involves splicing together things that were published for one purpose and enlisting them in some quite different endeavor. Manga scroll is a fairly straightforward example. It's a 20-meter long scroll composed of digitally collaged snippets of cartoon onomatopoeia. It is also a score for performance. And it is also a book that, if you own it, you can turn through and play the performance in your head. The book of his famous installation, The Clock, is more elliptical. It documents the 24-hour-long video in which every minute of the day is represented through old film clips. As an installation, The Clock is immersive and mesmerizing. It has been responsible for way too many broken dinner dates and missed submission deadlines. The editing of the video is immaculate, artful ruptures, seamless segues, building and thinning, even as the whole maintains its persistent clockwork structure. But none of that can be accomplished in a book. The book provides one film still for each minute of the day, 1,440. But there is no external control on how long you can spend looking at any given still. You can speed time up, you can freeze it, you can even make it go backwards. The pacing is literally in the viewer's hands. Arturo Herrera's screen-printed flea market books involve a very different type of reuse and a much more abrupt assertion of tactility. The application of roughly screen print inked over the pages turn the contents into substrates. And if it often thwarts the original function of whatever the book was, say, teaching East German youths the basic of karate, it reasserts the book's material particularity as a thing to be looked at, held, touched, rather than simply read. And this, in a sense, brings us back to Mary's girdle book. In the 21st century, we have more pictures and words than we know what to do with. Text and image are now fully disembodied in the sense that their physical platform can be altered instantly from phone screen to laptop screen to projector. Look, don't touch has become our default mode of interacting with the world. And the thinginess of things, or more precisely, direct physical experience of the specific thinginess of specific things, has become something of a rarity. And this makes the very objecthood of a book a type of content. So I want to close with two books that do not involve reuse or representation or recycling. The first is Taube Auerbach's RGB Color Space Atlas, which is quite simply a physical manifestation of an optical principle, the cubic color space in which colors are aligned with dimensions, one for height, one for width, one for depth, and blend along the three axes of dimensional space. It's an easy enough idea and familiar enough from diagrams. But in making that idea physical and allowing us to actually flip through it, Auerbach has created something both beautiful and unexpectedly strange. And it says something curious about how conceptual understanding, visual perception, and haptic comprehension align and separate. The last book I want to talk about is Absence, which was designed by architect Mi Jin Yoon in 2003. Like Auerbach's book, it is at once a book and a sculptural object, a little handheld-sized brick of a book of thick white card pages. But where the Auerbach books can be entered with equal validity from any point, Absence has a beginning and an end, an up and a down. The first 10 pages look like this: die cut with a single hole in the same place. On the 11th page, the die cut design changes to 2 squares. These are large enough that you can see that they extend the full depth of the book, creating 2 tall, thin cuboid voids, 108 pages deep, or to look at it from the ground up, 108 stories tall. The last page is cut with the ground map of Ground Zero. Negative space can be framed in any number of ways. But in revealing it gradually, page by page, absence transforms a simple statement of loss into an evocation of process. And that process connects us not just to the Twin Towers, but further back to the millions of pages turned over hundreds of years in pursuit of explanation or escape or solace. I own a copy of this book, and I keep it on a shelf where I come across it frequently. I know how it ends, but every now and then I feel the need to take it down, leaf through its wordless pages for reasons I can't entirely explain. One of the observations of Boethius, carted around in that not very gorgeous girdle book, is, who would give a law to lovers? Love is unto itself a higher law, which seems about as good an explanation as any. Thank you.
So Allah Ebtekar is the next speaker. Born in Oakland to a family, Berkeley, I'm sorry, just over the line in Berkeley, close. Born in Berkeley, that's even better. To a family with deep roots in the formidable artistic traditions of Iran. Allah Ebtekar's work revives iconic forms of traditional Persian art and poetry, and does so respectfully, but in a way that is also fresh, brilliant, and very contemporary. Please welcome Allah Ebtekar.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Susan. That was a great presentation, which I hope I can kind of... Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Is it possible to dim this light a little bit? The one on me? If possible, that would be great. We can take a little trip together and hopefully see these images a bit better as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent research project and series of works, as well as a series of artist books, some still in the making, titled Safina or Safineh, the Arabic term for a vessel or ship. And it actually has more meanings than that. In the Persian literary and artistic landscape, it refers to a certain kind of book, and this dates back to some earliest examples are around the 14th century. But a compendium, essentially, of texts that span different generations, sites, and really text that varies from poetry to prose, geometry to astronomy, and quite often also poetry. It's an image of the beloved 14th century Hafez reading a Safina manuscript. What's also very kind of unique to this format of book is that it is, instead of oftentimes books that open this way with the spine being the longer end, it's actually bound through the smaller end, and it's read vertically. So instead of left to right or right to left, you're reading this book or manuscript from top to bottom or bottom to top. The middle example is actually a prayer book from my own library. It's I think it's late 1800s, if I'm not mistaken, lithograph printed. What's actually quite remarkable about it, that this photo does not do justice, is that there's also a lot of notes and glosses that happen through time since the book was first printed. So you really have this kind of collapsing of time and space with multiple authors lending a hand through commentaries. The image to the right is going back to late Timurid, so looking at around the 1500s. Anthology of text, again, this one is mainly poetry, but also poetry from different eras, different centuries, coming together in this one bound manuscript. illuminated as well, and there's some stenciling going on around the calligraphy. But these are also books that are small, so they're portable. So they're oftentimes no bigger than, something that could be put, in your pocket. So it travels with you. And that really kind of struck me as something quite interesting. Not only is it maybe the kind of mixtape of its era, but it's also something that, in a way, metaphorically moves you through these imaginary journeys. And I should say that the word safina in popular language and culture most often actually means spaceship. So this connection of the book and spaceship or a ship was quite interesting for me. This is an actual, so I'll talk a little bit about the works that were on display in this exhibition, which is a solo show titled Safina in the fall. And the work that you're seeing is actually on the wall, rather, is a work called Nightfall. And it's about 12 unbound book pages from Isaac Asimov's Nightfall. And it's this beautiful short story that Asimov in 1941 responds to a quote by Emerson. So talking about borrowing and this kind of recycling and being really kind of things being informed from the past, but also prompts for new works to happen. So Asimov takes this this quote from Emerson, which was in his Nature essay, and develops this fictional, this sci-fi fictional short story about a planet by the name of Lagash that is illuminated by 6 suns. And because of these 6 suns and its orbit, it actually never has a nightfall, all but every 2,000 years. And every 2,000 years, because of this eclipse that happens and sets this planet in darkness, people see the stars for the first time. And by doing so, they go mad, which is kind of interesting. I mean, you could look at it in mysticism kind of literature as that being enlightenment, or maybe it's just pure madness. But regardless, it became a place for me to start working with this concept. And what I've been doing with these works is these are all on original first edition book pages from Asimov's Nightfall that I have worked with imagery from NASA, some good deep survey archives, and essentially it's a cyanotype process of treating the book pages with something that makes the page exposed with light. So the works become birthed by light, and in this case, by the starlight. So I leave them out after treating them in the dark room and expose them to the night sky. And there's enough UV light that's emitted from the stars that can actually create an exposure or create a print from that. But I also look at it as a kind of a durational work. So they're left from dusk to dawn, and they vary, and they kind of come together in this way. And just to kind of back up, I prior to studying Iranian coffee house painting, I actually studied illumination and the book arts tradition in Iran. And this is another series, a kind of an older work that I often I reference, and it's this kind of idea of illumination. And I'd actually think that this way of working is not too far off from it. It's maybe a little bit of a departure, but conceptually, this idea of the book page being illuminated somehow or informed by light. And this is actually how I work with these. So this is actually a glass, kind of like a lens that serves as a lens, and book pages are left underneath it. This was actually from a Zenith work, which was a kind of a collaboration with the sun. But for the Nightfall, the works are very much this kind of collaboration with the stars. And similarly, the other work that I was going to discuss that was part of Safina was 36 views of the moon, also night exposures. And the work takes, rather the kind of the prompt that I was in a way responding to was this quote by Omar Khayyam, 11th century astronomer, poet, mathematician. And essentially, the work is working with a negative from James Lick Observatory, right up here in Northern California, an image of the moon that I then kind of enlarged. And in this particular work, instead of working with one specific book, I'm actually looking at 10 centuries of texts that have referenced the moon. So from Rudaki to Malcolm X and to even some more contemporary local poets. The work you're seeing on your left is actually a page from a Rudaki, even though he was 9th century. This was a lithograph printed book from my own library, which was really hard to kind of, in a way, vandalize, but I think from that vandalization, it becomes kind of honoring it as well. But treating it with a same solution in the darkroom and bringing it out to be exposed by moonlight. And this one's a little bit more tricky because you're working with moon phases and trying to get enough a day or a night rather that the light from the moon is present enough to produce this print, essentially. The variation of colors that you see is also from different types of paper that occur, obviously, from these different types of books. And there's very much, obviously, this connection with text and image that I'm looking at, which has kind of informed my work for over 20 years. And in times you see the text reveal itself, and oftentimes it's hidden. It might just be one of the kind of endnote kind of folios or pages. And sometimes it's there, but you kind of have to look a little bit more carefully to see the text. They come together in this way. They're framed, so you do kind of engage with them on this scale. And hopefully they do something from a distance, and they do something as you kind of get closer to see some of the details. And I should also say that this work is in 4 seasons, meaning that each edition of 4, or iteration of 4 is done in a season. Both thinking about the different kind of light that's from that season, but also looking at them a little bit more site-specifically, in the sense that the fall edition was in the Gulf region in the Middle East, and the winter edition was just on view at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, and more locally, the spring edition was on view at the McAvoy Foundation for the Arts. And I really look at the history of where I'm creating these works, and how the literary kind of traditions from each of those sites might inform the work. So each of these works have a bibliography that I'm kind of in a map that you can kind of explore further. And this is the one from the McAvoy right here in San Francisco. Very similar, but if you get closer, you see all the kind of variations from edition to edition. It's working with the same negative, so you have that kind of consistent and somewhat, image that says, but there's so many kind of variations with the book pages, as well as the different types of light and exposures that you're getting. And I'm just gonna leave you with this, because it's quite, I think talking about books, it's something that sticks with me, and it's a Emerson, it's a text from Emerson, which reads, "In a library, we are surrounded by many hundreds of dear friends, but they are imprisoned by an enchanter in these papers and leather boxes. And though they know us and have been waiting 2, 10, or 20 centuries for us, and are eager to give us a sign and unbosom themselves, it is the law of their limbo that they must not speak until spoken to. Thank you.
David Sr. is a transplant to San Francisco from New York, where he developed a deep knowledge and understanding of the now burgeoning production of contemporary conceptual bookworks. It's a perspective he brought to his work in the library at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He is now head of library and archives at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. From my admittedly narrow perspective, I think of it kind of as the Giants trading for the Yankees' star third baseman. So please welcome David Sr.
Thanks. Oh, it's bright. I was very cozy over there. Thank you, Susan and Ala, for their presentation. I was hoping I might get skipped over and enjoy the rest of the proceedings in the comfort of the chair. This is very elegant situation here. Let's give a round of applause again for Stephen Woodall for gathering us together. It's so cool. And I had a chance to visit his show, Strange Days. And if you haven't seen it yet, go grab it. Go take a look. You can leave now and use this time to go see that show. It's full of heartbreakers. There's so many beautiful, luscious things in that show, and it's so well hung. And the books just stand out in really miraculous ways. So there's some really special things just outside this door. If you haven't seen it, make sure that you see it. It's a real treat for all of us here in the Bay Area to have that here. This is my desk. This is the way the desk usually looks. It's full of piles of books. Pleasant sentences or jarring sentences sometimes come out from those books. Sometimes to form a weird sentence. I often feel like that's how thought works. You know, you're hit by something, and it leads to something else. And that's sort of how I've arrived in libraries, is to be jarred by the work of others, to be hit by works. And there's sheer volume coming into libraries where I worked, where it's constant on a daily basis, and the covers and the contents provide an instigation to direct my thoughts in different ways. The talks that I do hopefully respond to that way of thinking, and maybe you're in my office and I'm just picking out books from that pile to tell a certain story. Today I'll talk about books. In a way, all these books have bodies in them, and I didn't realize that until after assembling it. This talk is about bodies in books. It was supposed to be a talk about technology and changing media landscapes and how those landscapes inform what goes into books that artists make. The book becomes a place to distill abrupt changes in our technological landscape, about how images and information get transferred and how artists find the Codex or some magazine or pamphlet as a safe space to distill some of that that they're receiving from the world. Whether we're talking about mass media in the historical avant-garde, the mass media of wood engraving you see in Stephen's show, the Dada collage and the response to mechanized war. You see the collage of wood engravings and mass media of newspapers and other things to create to explode language and to explode image in new ways. I'm totally moved by the constructivist project to explode language, and how that project emanated through Europe in wild and interesting ways. And this book takes us to Czechoslovakia, Vítězslav Nezval's Abeceda. So this is the first beginning of this idea that I'll begin to talk about living in other forms to have new forms. So this is occupying a really basic book form, the abecedarium, right? And this Vítězslav Nezval wrote an experimental poem where reflecting on the alphabet. But the sort of titan of Czech constructivism, Karel Tajga, designed the book and designed the text. And it was also had this third component and a major component where Milsa Majorova danced the alphabet. And the dance happened separate from the book too, in live performances. Maybe if you're in the mood, you can stand up and do the alphabet with us. Shake off the lecture. Sitting. A, B, E. It's just magical, right? H. I like H. H is strong. H is strong. K's got a little jazz. I like K. L. M. R. I like to show images. I like to flick through images for talks. It gives me a break. W. That's pretty cool, right? Okay, so we'll abruptly leave the historical avant-garde, but this, and I think having Stephen show here as a background, it gives us a sense too that maybe the conversation I'm thinking about begins there, begins with Dada, begins with surrealism, begins with constructivism, the isms of the historical avant-garde, and how I see that, and it comes up in the language that Stephen used as sort of like the response to the First World War and the mechanization of war, but also so many other things happening in industry, with speed, with cinema. The senses are being transformed, and you see it with the transformation of language in some of this, and image in some of these applications. We'll hurtle into the sort of 1960s environment of sort of conceptual practices or the use of publications as a way to capture things that were ephemeral, performance, art gestures, that kind of thing. This is Yves Klein's Leap into the Void that was staged and photographed by Harry Schunk, a really important figure in that he photographed a lot of these performances that were coming out of the Nouveau Realism movement in Europe and then into New York and Fluxusy type things in downtown scene. But the fun thing about this image is it first appeared in public in this newspaper. This was a newspaper that Yves Klein made. Oh, it's big. Look, the screen is very big here. You can read it along. The cool thing about it was that he originally inserted it in newsstands around Paris. So you would have encountered it in sort of a guerrilla gesture in the sort of where you would go to pick up your Sunday paper in Paris. This is by a newsstand right near the Eiffel Tower. And obviously appropriating the format of a newspaper, of the mass media format. I love this image so much. This was another element of the leap into the void on the newsstand, and as a gesture of surprise and questioning of like, what is this strange thing that you would have encountered by mistake, maybe? So we have newspapers, we have abecedariums. Here's a postcard. This is a postcard published by a gallerist and curator named Ses Sigalab. Ses Sigalab, among other things, was known for his Xerox book, which was a publication that was an exhibition in a book that was from the late 1960s. This is a work with Jan Dibbets, a Dutch conceptual artist from 1968. In this postcard, it gives you an instruction. So if you go to this window in Amsterdam at this time, May 30th, 1969, you will see Jan Dibbets doing this gesture. So that's the work, and that's the postcard. And you would have received this in the mail, maybe, if they had your address. Otherwise, it exists with an unfortunate library stamp at the Museum of Modern Art. I often think about this period of artist publishing and other forms of media practices that were sort of do-it-yourself technologies that were being enabled by changes in that technology. So cheap offset allowed this kind of stuff to happen in different ways. In the film of video and TV, the Porter Pack was sort of the equivalent. So artists started thinking about guerrilla television, cable access, that kind of thing. Making video works as part of their practice was really accessible. So I see these mediums of new video and publishing going hand in hand. And this is an interesting anecdote that marries these two sort of new media practices in one project. There was a guy in Germany named Jerry Schum who ran something called the Video Gallery, Jerry Schum, Fern's Gallery. But in this project, he had a project in West German television where interspersed into the programming at like 7 o'clock in the evening, he inserted this project of Keith Arnett, who was a British artist, on between two programs on West German TV. So if you were tuned in at 7:30, say, on one evening, you would see Keith Arnett, one image, two images, going down, see Keith. Keith's gone. Yeah, he's risen. We can do it again. This is a book, but you can see the TV screen applied to the image to get at that. Sorry, I could keep doing this all day. To get at the idea that the project originally happened on television, but it's a book. In De Krant is a book by Hans Eichelboom from the mid-'70s, which was in the paper in Dutch. This is another performance that uses the newspaper. He lived in Arnhem in the Netherlands, and you can read along. I had made an effort to appear in 10 consecutive days on a newspaper photograph at least once each day. So the book is very slim, maybe like 25 pages, and in it is just the reproductions of the newspaper page and image where Hans Eichelboom appeared. You'll see this lurking hippie back here. Here we go, one more. So he went to sort of ribbon cuttings, other kinds of parades, other kinds of events, and inserted himself into this. He's in the middle there watching it go up. I like this one the best. It's like some town hall meeting. He's in the back there. This one's pretty grim, pretty Dutch, like the bicycle accident, where he's in the back there. He's smoking here. The next one, I feel like this is kind of a pair to this Hans Eichelboom book, and it was produced around the same time. The Eichelboom one was from Amsterdam. This one was from Zagreb. It's by an artist named Sanja Avekovic, and it's called A Tragedy of a Venus. And Sanja Avekovic paired her images from her own sort of collection of portraits that she had taken of herself with a tabloid article about Marilyn Monroe. So she staged them next to each other in sort of diptychs, and then took the image or the caption from the tabloid article as the title of the diptych. So this one is Still Without Self-Confidence. She didn't pose for these, like her own images, she just had a large collection of images that she had from her own practice. This is called Sad and Melancholic. Already a member of high society. Since childhood, fascinated by the sea. Pleasant and unpleasant encounters with the telephone. So there we are in 1960, this is to 76. And these next books are also from Zagreb, and a really wonderful artist named Mladen Stilinovic. He passed away a couple years ago, but he made these handmade books that were taped together photographs. He was a filmmaker, and often these books remind me also of like storyboards or kind of, they're very filmic. This is what they look like in a show that I organized at MoMA in 2011. And these are how they were originally made. He was part of a collective called the May of 75, a group of artists that did street performances. And part of the reason I'm captivated by these books are their original place of distribution, which was on street squares or public squares where they would have performances. Here's people encountering the books, and they're laid out pretty simply. There's sort of an arte povera idea of using the most base materials to construct the books. Here they are on the reading room desk at the Museum of Modern Art. This is the a book called Foot-Bread Relationship, which is just the artist kicking a loaf of bread. He adopted these symbols, mostly symbols of the state, essential sort of materials to reflect on in his performances. This is May 75. He took pictures of the state propaganda for the sort of Labor Day events of May 1st in Zagreb, but he inserted amongst the state propaganda a letter to his lover. This is just Stipa loves Adu. He hung a sign in the street for his lover, intermixing a personal anecdote with the state imagery. And this one's just fun. This is called a sidewalk step, which is, he just put a weird cotton pad across the sidewalk and took pictures of people. And this is the last two books I'll show. This is Sad, Depressed People by David Horowitz. All the numbers on the front are the numbers, the ID numbers in the catalogs of like Corbis or Getty Images for images that you would find when you plug in sad, depressed people. So here they are. The artist is really interested in how these images are used by the pharmaceutical industries as advertisements for their product, and he wanted to isolate where they existed in these image data banks. He performed this book himself. This is him on the cover of a book called Mood Disorder. He's at the beach. What he did for this book was he put it on the page for Mood Disorder as the image. And he gave it a Creative Commons license, so anyone could use this image. And then he tried to track where the image went. And the book Mood Disorder reproduces the web pages where this image happened. So here's the Creative Commons page for his image on Wikipedia. And then the book is all of these screenshots of pages where people use this image. It went really far and wide, and it went across the world. And it's interesting about sort of getting at one idea about our image economy, as Susan mentioned, about the sort of circulation of images, how it works, and how we're inundated with images. And this is one clear project where, through the book form, you're distilling it in some way, shape or form, to try to get at these questions about how images are created, how we respond to them, and how we can manipulate them. And that's all I'll say about that. I think, but this is an example that I'm seeing more and more with younger people as using the book space as a space to reckon with their digital experience, as a way to slow things down, as a way to create strange taxonomies of the things that they're encountering, and playing around with that space of the book to make sense of the world in a way that artists did with thinking about mass media in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, of television, of film, of magazines and newspapers, or artists in the historical avant-garde were doing with increased shifts of their industrial landscape of cities, of new film environments, and that kind of thing. So I think we can see through this as a persistence, interestingly, of a very old technology being a very functional tool to help us change with radical changes in media and how we can perceive the world. Ta-da, thanks. Thank you.
That's great. You know, that was a lot of slides that David showed very efficiently. So we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we will start promptly at... Okay, I'm going to introduce Barbara Madsen, who is our next speaker. And if you were able to see the exhibition upstairs, I was thinking, as I was putting together the books, I said it would really be good to have a contemporary book that participates in this great surrealist tradition. And I happened to think, well, I have a book around that does that, and it's Barb Madsen's book, Unspecified Object. It is a perfect surrealist exercise. Barbara Madsen, in her art practice, takes a close look at everyday objects that we don't pay much attention to and brings them into the realm of art, allowing to consider them maybe as sculptural works or something emblematic of an aspect of our culture. The poet she worked with on this book, Rosa Zamora, is originally from Venezuela. Her work bridges languages and cultures. You'll see in their work in the exhibition upstairs, but now they will tell you about how that work happened. So I'm very happy to present Barbara Madsen.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen Woodall, for the invitation. Thank you to the Achenbach Foundation, and thank you to the Jonathan Logan Foundation for generously supporting this event. And we're very honored, Ellie and I, to be selected and included in this exhibition. When I saw the title, Strange Days, Dada and Surrealism in the book, I thought, strange days we are indeed living in. It couldn't be more fitting and more appropriate. Just a little bit of a background. As an artist, I'm a little bit of a raccoon. I collect all sorts of objects, and I photograph those objects, and they become kind of the impetus for many of the works that I end up doing, whether it's photogravures, sculptures, installations. In 2013, I was invited to do an exhibition at the New York Public Library in the pictures collection, and also in the corner room. And I was photographing, my strange objects, often kind of cast off detritus, junk, really from the mechanical age and from the industrial age, plastic era, and all the kind of crap that mostly ends up in the landfill. And I found myself, you know, working with a certain amount, a certain degree or class of objects that were falling into a norm. And as Susan said earlier, she kind of was talking about throwing the wrench into your practice. And that's kind of what I wanted to do when I was photographing these objects. And so I was thinking about what would happen if I didn't actually select the objects. What if I actually put an open call on something like Tumblr and had people submit the objects? What I then did is I selected 2 jurors. I invited Jared Ash, the assistant museum librarian at the Metropolitan, and Arezzo Messino, the senior art librarian at the New York Public Library, and I asked them to select images. I asked them to choose 6 projects each, or 6 images each, and I didn't give them any parameters. I just said select things that like intrigue you. And so I came up with 12 images. Actually, there were a few extras because there was some overlap between the jurors. And the winners actually had to send me the physical objects. So I asked them to send the physical objects to me. And then I had to decide how I was going to approach those images. And when I received the images, it was a very disparate selection, and I wasn't quite sure how I would pull them together. But I was reading Donald Judd's seminal essay, The Specific Object, at the time, and something struck me really kind of wonderful and interesting, which is the tradition of the artist, is that traditionally artists kind of like challenged their predecessors, and Judd was challenging the idea of the illusionary the 19th century romantic illusionistic space. And I thought, you know, he's rejecting that space. What would happen if I take that space back? So in taking that space back, I wanted to challenge the hierarchy of authorship. I wanted to challenge the hierarchy of scale, challenge the interior space, the gallery space, and many other things. And so a little bit of kind of background in what I was thinking in some of these objects. You know, as an artist, we can't help but throw our layers of baggage on images. And so this idea of the pitchfork is a really loaded thing for me, and this is serendipity that they ended up coming to me, some of these things. So, you know, I have the fraught relationship with my history of religion and coming out and, you know, being kind of an outcast. So it kind of like became a nice little kind of way to like introduce, you know, these images within the context of like this fraught space. Each book, you know, each page is followed by poetry that I will talk about in a little bit. The seed pod, actually just a little bit of background. In terms of like the people who contributed the objects, Lisa Jacobson was the contributor for the pitchforks. Lauren Stillwell contributed the seed pods. And yesterday I was reminded about how my connection to the land is a really important connection, and I feel like it's been lost. Yesterday I was reminded once again of my relationship to the land, going down to Land's End, going over to the Presidio and walking along the shore and hiking along the trail, smelling the eucalyptus and smelling the cedar, and being immersed in that nature again reminds me of how disconnected we are with nature. And I felt that was a really rejuvenating experience for me, having grown up in Idaho, of all places. And so it kind of like really kind of brought me back to nature. Brandon Koch gave us the Indonesian figure. When I put out this call, I asked them to send each of the contributors to actually send in a little note, a little bit of a kind of why, a written statement of why some of these things were significant. And the title for this piece actually struck me, which was a really great title. It says, "The Indonesian Creature Attempting to Eat an Egg, Much Too Big for It to Consume." And I love that title. It's just a really beautiful kind of image for corpulent greed, and it's just a great image. And so, I had a lot of fun playing with the scale of these, photographing my own eggs and putting them on the backs of the maquettes. So just tongue-in-cheek, kind of having a lot of fun. So Nina Burrell contributed the cicadas. And because I love to photograph collections, many years ago, I was actually in the Florida Department of Agriculture, and I got to spend 3 days photographing their entomology collection. So they have like 8 million specimens, and I took my 4x5 camera in there and got to photograph for a few days. So I have a special relationship to insects, and so I kind of wanted to monumentalize these cicadas within the space as if they were becoming alien creatures ready to take over the planet. And this piece, the little piece, the little shard is actually a construction piece that comes out of a piece. I just actually threw it into the gallery space, and then inverted it, threw it on its end. Whoop, I went the wrong way. So this tiara came to me from a theater director, a gay opera theater director. His name's Henry McCarthy. And again, that fraught relationship that I have with authority, and wanting to just kind of like let it sink down a hole. It was kind of like a nice little metaphor for me. I was living in Scotland at one point in time, and there were a lot of protests against the Queen of England, and that kind of was one of my political awakening moments, watching the Scottish people reject the British Queen and really wanting to oust her. So it kind of stuck with me politically. Let's see, Brian Bulfer contributed these maker-bought stupas. And they just selected one, but when he came to drop off the large stupa in the center, he had all of these other really beautiful little 3D printed stupas, and I fell in love with all of them. And it became kind of like the centerfold, really, for the book. Angel Belleran. I wanted to, again, when I was playing with that modernist white cube, it's like just take a little bit of labor and throw the bobbins on the whole cube. And some of these, another piece, the amp, and the film back that has 6 written on it. Kind of like the fact that it was 6. I could have added 2 more 6s to it and made it 666, which would have even been more interesting. But he didn't do that. Their tornado was donated by Jackie Dew, and I have all these little glass globes in my studio, and I took the opportunity to actually photograph them and paste them on the walls of the maquette, and then bring her little Kansas tornado snow globe into the middle of it. Alexander Berry and Taylor McGill. On the left, the little bracelet, I have a love for my garden and my peas. And so I built the maquette and then put the maquette out in my garden and photographed it with the peas showing through the windows. Just again, my way of bringing nature back into the gallery and back into the space. And I wanted, with the nuns, I wanted to create this oculi, whether you call it the James Turrell oculi or, just kind of, playing with that with these little bowling pin nuns. And just to give you an idea of scale, they were about a ½ an inch big. And, knowing me, I'm a little bit sarcastic and a little bit cheeky, so I had to throw the rabbit riding a rocket in the background. Just my own tricks and jokes to myself, some of the poems. And lastly, this mask was made by Melissa Potter in Tbilisi, Georgia, and was made for gay activists to actually participate in protest marches in Georgia. And the text, and then what I would like to do is invite Ellie to come up and read some of the poems. We're going to read 2 of the poems. She's going to read in Spanish, and then I'll read in English. And then I've invited her to actually talk a little bit about how she approached some of these images. Ellie is originally, as Steve said, is from Venezuela and a poet. We've been collaborators for many years, so I invite Ellie to come on up.
Good evening. Thank you so much to Steve Woodall for inviting us here and including our book in the exhibition, Strange Days. And thank you, all of you, for being here tonight. And I want to also thank Barbara Madsen for inviting me to collaborate with her in this project. So we're going to read first so this is the Indonesian creature. Oh, thank you. So this poem is called Indonesian. Oh, could you? I moved it. Could you? I moved it. Indonesian creature attempting to eat an egg much too big for it to consume. I'm going to read it in Spanish because I don't like to read in English. El supermercado es una isla de caimanes. El jardín necesita agua. La mujer no consigue sus lentes. Breath check. Bésame, soledad. Un papel. Ausencia de lo efímero que regresa. Vapor subiendo de la carne. Animales muertos. Sangre artificial para la duración del dolor que sentiremos. 58 tipos de jugo de naranja. Neblina empujando carritos, azúcar, maltodextrin, corn syrup, Maquiavelo. Es un misterio que ella se haya ido y yo durmiéndome en el tren, en el sofá, en mi propio sueño, sin pensar que todavía temo.
The supermarket is an island of alligators. The garden needs water. The woman can't find her glasses. Breath check. Kiss me, solitude. A piece of paper. Absence of the ephemeral that returns. Steam rising from the meat. Dead animals. Artificial blood for the duration of the pain that we will fill. 58 kinds of orange juice. Haze pushing carts. Sugar, maltodextrin, corn syrup. Machiavelli. It is a mystery that she is gone, and I'm falling asleep on the train, on the couch, in my own dream, without thinking that I'm still afraid.
And this one is called The Crown, or Crown, actually. Hay un carro ahogado en la inundación de la calle. Todo el pueblo ha desaparecido y solo hay desolación. El infierno es un avión repleto de dinero y luces rojas. La reina petrificada reposa en su castillo. En la foto del periódico, 5 hombres bien vestidos caminan juntos a organizar el futuro de las economías del mundo en medio de una ruina que algún día fue mi calle.
There is a drowned car in the flooded street. The whole town has disappeared, leaving desolation. Hell is an airplane full of money and red lights. The petrified queen rests in her castle. In the newspaper photo, 5 men in suits walk together, organizing the future of the world's economies among ruins where I once played.
That's it. And then they wanted me to talk a little bit about how I approach the writing of these poems. So, well, when Barbara invited me to collaborate with this project, it was very clear for me from the beginning that she wanted to step out of her regular approach to her creative writing process, creative writing of her creative process. So I try to keep the premise. I first started researching each of these objects. One of my biggest challenges was to how can I find my voice through these objects. So I started by reading the information that each of the artists selected sent, and then from there I researched further. Each of these findings led me to another finding and to the meditation of other things. So, for example, in the supermarket, the Indonesian creature holding an egg too big to be consumed was talking about greed and hyperconsumerism and how that the egg was food, so it led me to the supermarket and thinking about that, and then about all the choices that we are constantly facing when we go to these places. So 58 types of orange juice, and then the chemicals that are in the food that we consume and how that affects our bodies. And so eventually, at the end, the poem became actually a creative response to this collective project, but it was also connected to my own voice because it goes back to the body. And so I'm falling asleep in the train. It was true, and so it was my pre-diabetic moment. So how all these became part of also my voice. So it was a combination that is departed with the collective and came back to my own voice, which is what I wanted to do. We are running out of time, but basically that's pretty much how we did it. Thank you very much.
So Felicia is next. Here she is. Okay, Felicia Rice, with an impeccable publisher's instinct, I say, has produced an impressive catalog of literary work in a fine art context. She has been doing this for 42 years, which is kind of hard to believe. Yes, that's worth a round of applause. So she's going to cover 42 years in 20 minutes. So please welcome Felicia Rice from Santa Cruz.
So thank you for having me closer to the mic. Thank you for having me, and I am going to ask you to join me on a sprint through 40 years of publishing and bookmaking today. I think of myself as a printer, an artist, a publisher, and a believer. As a printer, my job is to confront complex issues and render my response to them in book form. As an artist, my job is to do so with profound integrity. As a publisher, my job is to make these issues public. And as a believer, I believe that each person must contribute however they can to build a better world. My books are my contribution. In this talk, I will present the history of my making and publishing books over 4 decades, and you will see how the books shift from being text-focused to text and image-focused, still driven by the word, but highly visual. I published my first book of poetry in 1980, so here we go. Yay. Okay. I published my first book of poetry in 1980. Boy, I'm much more relaxed, too. Oh, that worked. Okay. In the early years, the 1980s to mid-90s, I made letterpress books and laser-printed chapbooks with local, regional, and national poets. These were books with a traditional treatment of word and image, with text and image on opposing pages. In the early 90s, the imagery began to be more prominent in my book work. These 2 books set my Chicanx Latinx series in motion. This series explores works of contemporary Chicanx and Latinx artists and writers in translation and is issued in both limited and trade editions. Each book is the result of a close collaboration between writer, artist, and myself. In the first book, De Amor Oscuro, of Dark Love, I was fortunate to collaborate with my father, Ray Rice, and poet Francisco X. Alarcón. The book was made up of 16 homoerotic love sonnets in Spanish and English. Here the drawings run underneath the poems as a frieze. So in 1991, I published De Amor Oscuro, of Dark Love, poems by Francisco X. Alarcón, drawings by Ray Rice, translation by Francisco Alarcón, in a limited edition of 70 and a trade edition of 700, and amazingly, the book went into a 3rd printing. A trade edition interprets the original book in an edition intended for general sale and available at an affordable price. If the text is so important that much time and effort has been lavished on the limited edition's production, it must be seen and read by a wider audience. The next book was with Elba Rosario Sanchez. Francisco and Elba taught at UC Santa Cruz, where I taught book arts 1 quarter per year for 14 years. The class was held in my studio and was project-based, students printing and publishing, faculty writing and images under the Moving Parts Press imprint. The book was a class project. So published in 92, Tallos de Luna, Moon Shoots, poems by Elba Sanchez, drawings by Robert Quirito, a limited edition of 75 and a trade edition of 750. The next 2 books, Song of the Andumbulu, 18 through 20, was another student-produced book, and Médocems, a commercially printed translation from the French. Elizabeth R. Jackson translated Henri Michaud's Médocems from the French. We did 2 books together in a short series titled the Livre d'Artiste series, Steve mentioned earlier. Among the crowning achievements of the 20th century book are the French Livre d'Artiste, limited editions integrating the visual and poetic text. I dreamed of publishing a series of books modeled on the career of publisher Ambroise Vollard, who we saw earlier, publishing the finest artists and writers of our time in book form. But life happened, and the series did not progress beyond 2 volumes. So in 1992, Médocems, poems and lithographs by Henri Michaud in French and English, translated by Elizabeth R. Jackson. The new edition replicated the original 1948 French Livre d'Artiste published by Michaud's associate and friend. The text is side by side with full-page lithographs. and the Moving Parts Press edition adheres closely to the original design. Poet Nate Mackey and sculptor Doyle Foreman both taught at UCSC when the next book was published. It was produced by students under my direction. In 1994, we published The Song of the Ondumbulu with the poems by Nate Mackey and a rubbing from a bas-relief bronze sculpture by Doyle Foreman on the title page. That was an edition of 150. The long, narrow poems define the dimensions of the book and dominate the page. Codex Hispangliensis was the result of a 5-year collaboration from 93 to 98 with Guillermo Gomez Peña and Enrique Chagoya, who we'll hear more from today. Published in 1998, the book paired performance scripts by Guillermo Gomez Peña and collage imagery by Enrique Chagoya with my book work. It was published in a limited edition of 45 in black and red and a hand-colored deluxe edition, which you see here, of 5. This is the 3rd book in the Chicanx Latinx series. The trade edition with City Lights Books of San Francisco has been in print since 2000. The book has taken on a life of its own, and in both limited and trade editions has prompted response from around the world, from academics, organizations, and individuals. Most recently, I had a request, questions about the book from a person who was using it as the basis for their PhD dissertation in India. So Enrique's 15 spreads that make up the book were delivered to me as old school printing mechanicals, separating the black on a board, all the imagery, and the red ink on an overlay above. The book was letterpress printed in black and red from zinc photo engravings on a mottled paper lined with Japanese tissue, and its accordion fold structure extends to 31 feet. Here the text is integrated into the page, but the text and image rarely overlap. Each has its discrete place on the page. They work closely together. Yves Perret, contemporary French poet, here with one of Ray Rice's painted wooden strips that inspired their collaboration. The two never met, but they just missed one another in Mendocino, and it was the poet who suggested my father create the imagery for their book, Cosmogony Intime, an intimate cosmogony. Ray Rice died in 2001 as a result of a stroke that took place in this studio with a paintbrush in his hand, 6 months after finishing Cosmogony Intime. Published in 2005, Cosmogony Intime, An Intimate Cosmogony, poems by Yves Perret, translation by Elizabeth R. Jackson, drawings by Ray Rice. There was a limited edition of 84. That's not very limited in my world. That's a lot of books. Yves promised me there were going to be big sales in France. Ha. And there's a limited edition, a deluxe edition of 12 also. The 5 poems in French and English are flank drawings in the gutter of the folded sheets that are hinged together to form an accordion fold book. And earlier we heard the word Laparello, or also concertina, accordion fold, all refer to the same book structure. Again, the text and image hold their own. They share the page but do not mix. The pen and ink drawings by Ray Rice are colored using the pochoir or stenciling process, and the deluxe edition is hand-painted in watercolor throughout by the artist. There are so many stories I'm not telling you. Monica Brown, Peruvian-American children's book author, wrote the alphabet book, Alfabeto Animado, the lively alphabet in Spanish and English. This is the 4th book in the Chicanx Latinx series. Published in 2009, the text appears in Spanish and English by Monica Brown, and translated into Quechua by Jenny Huarhua, produced in a limited edition of 8. The book is populated by hand-knit finger puppets set in scenes drawn and printed on a rainbow of cloth from Cusco. Driven by active verbs in Spanish, the alphabet progresses 2 letters at a time through a series of scenes, M and N here. Manejar, to drive. The monkey is driving the truck down and it's careening toward the stream in which the alligator and the bird are swimming, nadar, to swim. In 2007, I was approached by Guillermo Gomez Peña and Gustavo Vázquez about making a book in response to their video project, Documentado Undocumented. 2 others were invited into the collaboration, and the 5 of us met over a 7-year period to produce the performative artist book, Doc on Doc. Doc on Doc is a mixed media production housed in a high-tech aluminum case, which contains my print codex with performance scripts by Guillermo Gomez Peña and critical commentary by art historian Jennifer Gonzalez, video by Gustavo Vázquez, and sound art by Zachary Watkins. Oops, something went, we're going the wrong way. Doc on Doc is a traveling case for apprentice shamans, a reliquary for imaginary saints, a toolbox for self-transformation, a quiet call to heal yourself with fetishes and antidotes, a border kit to face the uncertainty of future crossings. The print codex stands alone or rests in the electronic case. Here type is integrated into the image, subsumed by the image as we so often see on screen these days. In addition, an excerpt from the script is printed below the image. Hear the line, free falling toward a borderless future, and the text, standing on the map of my political desires, I toast to a borderless future. With our Alaskan hair, our Canadian head, our US torso, our Mexican genitalia, our Caribbean vulva, our South American legs, our Antarctic nails, jumping borders with ease, jumping borders with pleasure. Amen. Amen. Explaining to a nurse what I do. The aim is for the book to perform the text, actual scripts for stage performance, in the absence of the performance artist. I was attempting to channel Gomez Peña's energy on stage in 2 dimensions. In Codex Hispangliensis, my first book with Guillermo scripts, I had largely kept them separate, but here the type and the image overlap. Readability is less and less important as the 2 elements merge. In 2017, City Lights published a trade edition of Doc on Doc. It presents the entire project and includes reproductions of the 15-page spreads and prints, and a USB drive with a video and sound art. Juan Felipe Herrera is a poet, performer, writer, cartoonist, teacher, and activist. Between 2015 and 17, Juan Felipe was the 21st U.S. Poet Laureate, the nation's first Chicano Poet Laureate. Border Bus is the 6th book in the Chicanx Latinx series. Published this year in 2019, Border Bus includes the poem by Juan Felipe, the prints by myself, an introduction by Carmen Jimenez Smith. It's produced in a limited edition of 34 and a deluxe edition within this illuminated case of 8. Border Bus is a rendering of one long poem. The poem takes place on a U.S. Department of Homeland Security ICE bus. 2 women have been detained while trying to cross the U.S.-Mexico border and are being transported to a detention center. They speak in English and Spanish, whispering to avoid the attention of the guard. The text is embedded in prints and interpreted in audio recordings of the poem included with the book on a USB drive. One woman speaks in English. She has been detained before, and the other is new to the experience. She speaks in Spanish. She is angry, frightened, sad, shaken. She tells the traumatic story of her family in Honduras and her journey to the border. ¿A dónde vamos? Where are we going? We are on a bus now. That is all. On a bus to nowhere. You got it? Those people there, who are they? Each spread is built in layers from several sources. In Doc on Doc, Images has had as many as 30 print runs through the press. In Border Bus, I was trying to capture the energy of the moment with as few image and type layers as possible. As it turned out, each sheet passed through the press at least 7 times for 7 layers of visual information. First, the solid, so here the red. Second, a large fingerprint that creates texture but also refers to the individual versus public identities, the personal versus the universal. Third, the photos, which I'll talk about. Fourth, the photo again in varnish to deepen the color. Fifth, drawings in green. Sixth, type, small and large in silver. And 7th, high gloss varnish. So here you see the source for the second layer, the photo images, a demonstration in Carlsbad, California against the ICE bus. Those people out there, who are they? The choice of the photo is the result of extensive web research and is printed in red on a red background from photopolymer plates. This is the opposing image, the demonstration in Carlsbad against the ICE bus, in red again on red. And I ran varnish over the photos to bring out the color for the fourth layer. My sketches of the women's faces were drawn from 2 films documenting the journey from Central America to the United States, Maria en Tierra de Nadie by Marcela Zamora and De Nadia by Tin Dirdamal. So here's the sketch, here's the face, here's the sketch. Here I'm laying out the text and images. I'm considering which text appears on which pages and the treatment of the type. I made about 100 drawings and used only a handful of them. For the 6th layer, I manipulated type in Photoshop, a different font for each voice to express the whispered exchange between the 2 women, which I then printed in silver to convey the quiet, intimate, but urgent conversation between them. A precedent for my type treatment was published in 1967 in the Evergreen Review, a visual typographic interpretation of Edith Piaf's performance of the song Le Fou by Madsen, a French graphic designer, art director, and typographer. Madsen not only used mixtures of typefaces and new compositional methods to present dialogue, he also manipulated dialogue by stretching and bending. Madsen's design and writings were influential in the US, where they helped trigger the post-functionalist approach to graphic design that led to the eclecticism of the late 80s and 90s. It was during this time, the 1980s and 90s, that I directed a graphic design program for UCSC Extension. I was exposed to the cutting-edge experimental typography of the time. David Carson comes to mind. He is best known for his innovative magazine design and use of experimental typography. In the 90s, he became the art director for the magazine Gunn. In the 90s, I created Codex Spangliensis and experimented with the ideas I was seeing in the commercial world. That exploration spilled over into Border Bus and future projects. The 6th layer, the addition of silver ropes of large type, an excerpt from the poem. And finally, the 7th layer of ink. Varnish of the interior of the bus was overprinted on each spread to convey the reflection of light in the bus windows and deepen the colors. Here you see the sequence of pages, the lavender spread following the red spread. The intent, again, is for the type and image to work together on the page, bringing out the emotional impact of the women's whispered conversation. Thirst and hunger, day after day, hermana. And they are riding La Bestia, the train through Mexico here. I just want us to be together. Freedom comes from deep inside. The poem closes with, we are nothing and we come from nothing, but that nothing is everything if you feed it with love. That is why we will triumph. We are everything, hermana, because we come from everything. Here you see the central panels at the end of the poem on the left, and on the right, the interior cover panel that leads to a reprinting of the poem in simple, clear type for easy reading. In my iterative process, I repeat the same steps over and over to refine the result. I feed the paper into the press 1 sheet at a time and make small changes with each sheet, adding ink, shifting the location of the printing plates, adjusting the position of the sheet in relation to the plates, adjusting the amount of impression. And although I dial all these in at the beginning of the press run, along the way I am monitoring and adjusting each variable. In the end, each printed sheet is unique. In designing and printing books in this way over the years, I have experimented and executed concepts repeatedly, then made small adjustments or major changes to respond to discoveries along the way and integrate new approaches to book design and bookmaking. The relationship of word and image is central to my attempts to bring the book to life, to perform the text in the absence of the author or performance artist. I have deep respect for the text and the images I work with. I read and reread the text. I listen to the words aloud. I sit with them before I begin selecting a typeface and laying out an image. In the early days, I was handling poems and images by other artists. I presented both cleanly and clearly on the page with plenty of white space to provide room for the eye to rest and to reflect. The elegant typefaces demanded elegant treatment. Here's a peek at my current project, The Necropolitics of Extraction by T.J. Demos. This is my contribution to the Codex Foundation's project Extraction, Art on the Edge of the Abyss, a multimedia, multi-venue, cross-border art intervention that investigates extractive industry in all its forms. And finally, here is my current book, Necropolitics of Extraction in Progress, showing the Chiron, a rolling text laid out beneath the landscapes with letters set in degraded form, calling out destructive and self-destructing systems contributing to environmental degradation, with phrases such as capitalism's rapacious commodification of anything and everything, and sacrifice zones given over to resource mining. The book ends on an up note, with the final line drawn from the afterword by T.J. Demos reading, "To make the impossible gradually possible, there is no other choice." Thank you.
All right. So our final speaker is Enrique Chagoya. Let me get rid of this. And get it up here. Yes. Enrique is one of the best known and probably one of the best respected artists in the Bay Area. His work is deeply involved with language as both a visual representation of speech and thought and a manifestation of power. His work, often amusing on the surface, nevertheless cuts deep. Please join me in welcoming Enrique Chagoya.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm going to go through quite a few slides, so I'm going to be moving a little bit fast. I wanted to talk a little bit about the way in which pre-Columbian books express very specific information without words. The last collaboration I did with a publisher was with Arion Press, and we're going to start with this book. This was influenced by the pre-Columbian imagery, which I'm going to explain a little bit more afterwards. But the book is by Juan Rulfo. It's called Pedro Páramo, and it was published in 2016. The faces half of a pre-Columbian face, half of like a hybrid mestizo character, are very much based on pre-Columbian sculpture, where you have half of a flesh, half face with flesh, half face with more like the skull. And I don't know if you have ever read Pedro Páramo, but it's a very important book in terms of what is called magic realism in Latin American literature, for better or worse. I'm not very crazy about that title, but this book inspired people like Gabriel Garcia Marquez to write his book, 100 Years of Solitude. And the book is a book about ghosts, pretty much, that happen in the place of Comala. And because everybody in the book, you don't know whether they are alive or dead. It's kind of like a Twilight Zone story. I decided to do some images that, even though they are not illustrations for the book, they play kind of like a duet. The book itself does not need any illustrations. But here you could see the front and the back of the pages of every book. And in any case, the idea of ghost that go through the whole book, and this character who's looking for his father, comes to this town and realizes that everybody in the town is kind of like a ghost at some point. And then when you keep reading the book, you don't know if the author himself is dead or the main character in the book is dead. Anyway, so here you could see a little bit of a pre-Columbian motif going into these figures. And I think if some of you might go tomorrow to Arion Press, you could see this book in person and might have a better sense than just through the slides. But going back to my codices, I began to make codices after reading a lot of history of the conquest of Mexico City. And one history that really stood with me was that beyond the genocide that took place in the continent with the killing and during the conquest, the war conquest in the Americas, besides that genocide, there was also a cultural side. And in this case, here you see, this is an anonymous Aztec artist who made this drawing representing indigenous leaders who refused to become Christian or to become Christianized. That in itself was a Holocaust that keeps happening until the present with many places where Native Americans are still being displaced of their land and killed. But another element that really affected me was the fact that the cultural side was very intense, particularly the destruction of books. Here you could see another illustration of probably the same anonymous Aztec artist showing a Dominican priest burning codices. You could see the little figure on the right with a little, sort of like an accordion book, which represents represents whatever is holding the content of the books that are being burned by these characters. A story that stood in my mind was especially the story of the destruction of the library of Texcoco. The library of Texcoco was built by a king who was against human sacrifice, King Nezahualcóyotl. Nezahualcóyotl means the hungry coyote. He made this pyramid dedicated to the unseen god, for instance. He had this very advanced idea of God for him. Nobody had seen God or seen her for him. And he created a pyramid with nothing in there, nothing to worship. And among other things, too, he built the largest library of the continent, the library of Texcoco. That library was burned by the Spanish conquistadors completely, to the point that there is not a single pre-Columbian Aztec books that survive the conquest. There are only right now there are only 3 Mayan books, and about 19, maybe 4, if we take into account one from Mexico City, and about 19 books from the Oaxaca region that are pre-Columbian. But the tragedy is that when the indigenous people witnessed the destruction of this library, there was a mass suicide. And the Spanish conquistadors and the soldiers could not even stop them when they saw them, hanging themselves from trees or jumping off pyramids. So it was very tragic. This library, again, was built by a poet, Nezahualcóyotl, and again, you will rarely hear that this was a poet who was against human sacrifice, King Nezahualcóyotl. We usually see movies like, Apocalypto, or, even anthropologists, even National Geographic, and the very first thing they go to is the human sacrifices of pre-Columbian cultures. So from that perspective, I decided to play the sort of like the primitive, savage artist, playing the false duality for me of civilization versus barbarism, where you wonder who is more civilized and who's more barbarian, regardless of where they're coming from. So I'm sorry, I touched the wrong key. Anyway, so here I have these couple of works that I did around the quincentenary of the arrival of Columbus, around 1992. There are ceramics, and then one is a miniature Coca-Cola bottles. The rest is some ceramic I casted. And it is called Monument to the Missing Gods. And then here, I wanted to show you this. This is, unfortunately, I don't see the feature for enlarging the book, which I wanted to have, and it's not in here. So I won't be able to enlarge this book. But this was the very first codex I did. It's in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. It was displayed about about a year ago. And I made this in 1992, and I think this is very much the base of what the book that Felicia Rice was talking about. It's a combination of a comic book imagery, like in this case, I have a collection of Superman in Spanish. I grew up reading Superman, among other things. I began to put together those images with pre-Columbian characters. This is Tlaloc, the god of rain. And this is another of my paintings. It's called Crossing, where Superman is actually the alien from out of space here confronting this pre-Columbian character. More images from the comic books. This is King Nezahualcóyotl, the one I was just talking about. This is painted by an indigenous artist who survived the conquest, who described exactly the pyramid I've mentioned to you, as well as the library of Texcoco built by this king. This was really at the peak of this king lived, he died a little before the Columbus arrival. So I imagine this was on the edge of a change in the Aztec culture, I hope. But anyway, so I decided to play with that. Again, it's the interaction of dualities, like the painting of Elisinski in the background, the red wedge against the white army. And more comic book characters that came to life in. I have to be very thankful to Felicia for ever putting together this book. But the language that I developed in this codex, besides the written language, but the visual language itself, is very much inspired by pre-Columbian books. In pre-Columbian books, there is no text. There is just imagery that interacts with each other, but without words. And sometimes we see that in some comic books. Few artists sometimes manage to have very, very few words in it. In the case of Guillermo lent the text of his performances, and it made a lot of sense because in pre-Columbian books, you have visual images, like, for instance, maybe not too different than visual images we see in an airport, where you see a logo and you know where is the bathroom or restaurants or whatever, and there is no words, or where is the luggage, etc. In pre-Columbian imagery, there is the same idea. So there is a language going on with the images themselves, and there is another written phonetic language with Guillermo's text. And there is yet another invisible element, and it's the hand of Felicia Rice, because she did this really amazing arrangement of text, images, and eventually she came to my studio. I hand-painted the pages. She helped me expanding the book on the floor. So it was quite a process. So, but I'm very happy this happened. But anyway, so I like to appropriate images when I find them, sort of like in a reverse anthropology way. Like in this case, this is a print by Theodore Debris describing Brazilian women cannibalizing this character. And again, today we live in times where the duality of civilization and barbarism keeps coming back to mind. All this xenophobia that exists against the refugees and immigrants from Mexico and Central America and Africa and many other places. It's very much, again, this fear of the other that might have started maybe, I don't know, from the times tribes existed, but my earliest recollection of civilization of barbarism as a concept, I think, came from the Greeks. So when I do like reverse anthropology, then I decided to be the indigenous artist who takes over a European art form or an artist's work and change it, like in this. This one is called The President's Xenophobic Nightmare in a Foreign Language. So here you could see every single possible stereotype, like a Mexican bandit, Asian, African, you name it. And in Russian, it's written that, I want to wake up now, in this moment. And in Spanish, las mujeres se quedan con las tripas, the women keep the tribe. Anyway, so I like printed matter. My work moved from printmaking to other media, to painting. And I decided to make a painting of a hemorrhoid. Here you are. So very often I get inspired by other artists that I appropriate. And so I got here, after Ensor. This could be two objects trying to eat an object bigger than that they could eat, sort of like paraphrasing Barb's description of her book. Anyway, so I'm gonna have to move fast because we're running out of time, but unfortunately I was not able to enlarge some of these books. But anyway, so this book got me in deep trouble once. Is the Misadventures of the Romantic Cannibals. And it's a book that satirizes the church for their hypocrisy with their sexual politics. They haven't done any or not much about the pedophilia scandal in the church, but also there have been scandals of rape of nuns, and in the other hand, they are very militant, very homophobic, very militant against same-sex marriage. I have a lot of gay, lesbian, transsexual, queer friends, and I took personally insult that the church is not acting accordingly to whatever the religious principles were. Love each other. The basic Christian message, especially Jesus' message, was love. And then you get all these acts of hate. There was somebody who saw the scandal that there was a picket line in an exhibition at the Loveland Museum where this work was. Somebody in Montana saw the same Codex I show you in Fox News, and she drove her 18-wheeler all the way from Montana to Colorado and destroyed the book. She got tackled and arrested, and unfortunately, this lady didn't know this was a print, a multiple. So. She didn't have to drive her truck all the way from from Montana to Colorado to destroy this. They only made more valuable the other 39 copies. It was a limited edition. Anyway, eventually the issues ended. A pastor saved me too from Colorado. He defended my work. He also got a lot of hate mail. But once the whole issue was over, he asked me if I could paint a picture of Jesus. And I told him, nobody knows how Jesus looked like in this case. And I told him, I'll do my own version, so I did. And then he invited me to go for the for the reception of the opening, and I was really afraid to go because it's Colorado, and I thought they're going to kill the pastor and they're going to kill me. You know, they kill you for less than that, than offending anybody. You know, like Columbine happened there, etc. But I went to inaugurate this painting. I end up making this painting. They loved it. I put the word love just to make sure that Jesus was not about hate. And I thought they might think it's some activist religious painting, but no, they loved it. They say there's a passage in the Bible that says the banner of love of Jesus was all over humanity. But anyway, so even though I'm not religious, I was very happy to do this. And I told the pastor, Jonathan Wiggins, that I was not religious. And I told him, if your congregation accepts this painting from me, I'll be happy to just give it for free. And they did. They accepted it. And it was a very happy end story. The museum that had the work had a lot of donations afterwards, and they opened a printmaking studio, and I was very happy because for weeks and sometimes even months, I was really worried. I even have death threats. I have to call the Stanford police. I have to talk to my neighbors, my students, and so on. Anyway, so I'm going to finish my lecture just showing you a few other formats of codices that I have done. And this is like a border print. And sources that I get. So you see this, some of these characters are in the back of the wall. I just painted them over. This is a lithographic book printed by Sharks Inc. in Colorado with Chinkole. Anyway, so I love stereotypes, and I got the results of my DNA. I wanted to define the stereotypes, but then I got the results of my DNA, and I happen to be very close to these characters because I am 51% Native American. I'm like 28% Southern Iberian, probably Spaniard, and the rest is from Northern Europe. I'm Jewish, Ashkenazi, North Arabic. I am also from North Africa, South Asian, and East Asia, among other places. So I'm from everywhere. I'm from nowhere. So we have done all these paintings on different, because here you could see a little more close up. That's a Persian guy for Allah here. Anyway, so I have done all these. This is from last year, hand painted, and I'm gonna show you some of my little paintings. End up being prints. This is a lithograph. So that's why I do the connection between printmaking, painting, and finally, this is my last image. I just finished this print this year. This one is called Detention at the Border of Language. And I don't know if you could read Border Patrol on the boat. But you could see this painting. This painting is based on Carl Weimar painting of Daniel Boone's daughter abducted by the Indians. That's the original title. I decided to do just a Pan-American indigenous characters here with a, as if it was Teotihuacan pyramid in the background, as you might see. But anyways, I'm sorry this time is very short to explain so many ideas in so little time. But thank you for listening to my chopped English and words and catching up with the rest of my work. Thank you very much.
Well, on that note, could you bring the house lights up a little bit? Somebody pointed out that in this 1920s mural on our ceiling, right there, is a woman reading a very large book. And it looks like she's about to fall into it, in fact. And she looks a little like Marilyn Monroe from the book David showed. We are going to reconvene, for those who would like to stick around a little bit, at the Achenbach Foundation down at the far end of the hall on the left. You'll have to give us about 10 or 15 minutes probably to just set it up. Felicia has brought some of her amazing books to show, and I think there may be a few other things to see down there. But do give us 10 or 15 minutes to set it up. I hope some of you or most of you can join us. Thank you.